And now, it's The Law Show on CL 650. A comprehensive look at everything you need to know about the law. Now, here's Sterling Fox.
Good morning and welcome to The Law Show here on CIL 650. Today on The Law Show, we're going to talk immigration and citizenship issues with our guests from MKS Law. Maynard, Kischer, Stojicevic in Vancouver. Rudy Kischer and Alex Stojicevic are with us this morning. Gentlemen, good to see you both.
Hey, good morning, Sterling.
Good to see you, Sterling.
We have, well, tell us a little bit about the firm before we get into it. It's going to be kind of a politically edged conversation this morning. The vote is on. We're going to talk about what the national platforms of all of the people who would seek your vote are and how it might relate to Canada's future. But first and foremost, let's take a look at Maynard, Kischer, Stojicevic. Rudy Kischer, tell us a little bit about the firm, how long you've been around, and the sorts of business that you conduct.
We are a boutique law firm, meaning that we specialize in one area. We only do immigration and citizenship law.
Okay.
We're based in Vancouver in historic Yaletown. There are three partners, myself, Alex Stojicevic, and Gordon Maynard. And we've been in business. The firm's been around for 12 years now, and we have. I would hazard to say that we are one of the leading law firms in this area in Western Canada. And we help all types of people looking to come to Canada. So we help corporations that have global mobility problems. If they're trying to move a CEO here to start a new business or to take over an arm of an existing company. We also help families that are trying to reunite. So if somebody has traveled and has fallen in love with somebody overseas and they would like their partner to come here, we help them with that, or to bring their parents and grandparents from abroad. We also help people getting work permits that are coming here for temporary purposes, and people that just want to come and visit. So we do a full variety. We also litigate and help people that have run afoul of the immigration rules and find themselves sort of before a tribunal or the federal court in terms of maintaining their permanent residency status.
Alex, I talked about at the very beginning of the show, we're going to talk about citizenship and immigration issues. And the typical Canadian civilian doesn't make a distinction. It's citizenship and immigration. It's one word. It used to be the Federal Ministry of Citizenship and Immigration. But in fact, there really are two very separate categories. When we say that phrase, citizenship and immigration, there really are two. Talk to us about the difference between the two.
Well, in Canada, before you can become a citizen, unless you have a right to citizenship through birth or through another connection of that sort, you have to become a permanent resident first. And you have to be a permanent resident for some time before you can be eligible for citizenship. So we've always, for the past, since World War II, in effect, we've had a version of permanent resident status that is based on we used to refer to these people as landed immigrants.
Right.
And they would have a document called a record of their landing. And they would get most of the same rights as citizens, but not all. They wouldn't be able to vote, stand for office, get a passport. Often they weren't eligible for Canadian military service. Many certain elements like this until such time as they applied for and became Canadian citizens.
Okay. So really, we should, if we're going to do, even if we're going to lump them together, we should do it in the proper order, Rudy. We should put immigration and citizenship instead of the way we've always known it, right?
Well,
because
one comes before the other, generally, right?
Chronologically, as you just said, one has to come before the other.
The ministry that is responsible for this has been called Citizenship and Immigration for a long time. And we've all sort of followed along with them. But historically, this ministry was called other things. For those of your listeners who remember the old days of Canada Manpower, before Service Canada, Canada Manpower was part of a ministry called Employment and Immigration.
Right.
So citizenship didn't play any role in that at all. But certainly since the mid-'90s, it's been citizenship and immigration, and that's how the federal ministry has operated.
When did the phrase landed immigrant become replaced?
2002, I think was that.
Officially 2002.
So landed immigrant became permanent resident.
It was already permanent resident since the 77 Act, but those phrases were used interchangeably. And the official reference to landed immigrant was eliminated in 2002.
Okay. So now we wanted to talk, since we are going to kind of lean in a political direction, which of course suits my guest to a T this morning, we're going to take a look at the parties all of them, and the platforms with respect to immigration issues that they're advancing during this current incredibly long campaign. But by way of doing that, the federal government, the Conservative Party, has certainly, they've been in office, Rudy, for 9 years.
Yep.
As they, and a lot of those years as a majority government, they've had an opportunity to quite dramatically change the way immigration is done in Canada. And they've got this new program called Express Entry. It's about 6 to 7 months old now, and we're starting to see the first wave of numbers coming through by way of some kind of measurement of how a lot of these new changes are coming through. What can you tell us in the wake of these first numbers being revealed about this Express Entry program?
Well, I think one of the first things that comes to mind is, number one, the numbers aren't very large. I mean, maybe that's a reflection of when the program you just started in January, but the reality is, in terms of visas, people actually landed that have become permanent residents that have started through that process. We've only seen, the recent number I saw was 411. 411 people in a program that immigrates 250,000 people plus a year is not a lot. So this being touted as the great solution to everything isn't really seeing a lot of volume coming through yet. Right, I think it's going to increase over the time. They are still doing, their response to this sort of criticism is, and we saw the Minister Alexander speak in Ottawa, and he was very clear that he feels that they're being unjustly criticized for it not working fast enough because they wanted to sort of walk before it runs, and therefore they're very slow on the intake. Right. But so it looks like people are coming through at a they're getting them done in 6 months, but they're not getting a lot of numbers done. Actually, at 411 people. That's a drop. There's probably more refugees recognized as Canadian permanent residents in a month in Canada than there are people that come through this system and actually get landed.
Alex, the government had kind of a bumper sticker description of what all of these changes were supposed to be about. Canadian citizenship, harder to get, easier to lose?
Sure.
That was the pitch line, wasn't it?
That was the tagline in the citizenship piece of this puzzle, and the idea there was, and this was a suite of reforms that were put forward between 2012 and the last parts took effect at the end of June of 2015, to make Canadian citizenship more difficult to obtain, to tie it to tax filing requirements, instead to take away the concept of residence and replace it with a much narrower definition of eligibility, which was tied to physical presence in Canada.
Okay.
So it's not about where your home is, it's where you're physically present. It's hard to be ambiguous with physical presence.
Sure.
You're either physically present or you're not, as opposed to being resident, which generated an enormous amount of litigation as to what the word residence actually meant.
And a lot of the rationale behind this onslaught of the immigration file by the Conservative Party, once they got into a position to really do something, and particularly during the majority years, was all about this mythical, perhaps, and you can help me with this, guys, this enormous backlog of cases, of applications, and there was just thousands, 30, 40, 50,000 cases, just this enormous queue at our collective door that had been allowed to accumulate over years and years. And by gosh, just give us the proper tools, as in a majority government, and just watch us just clear that out. Can they at least now, going back to the voters, X number of years later, lay claim to having cleared that backlog out?
I would say that they've made significant steps into improving that backlog.
Was there the backlog that they would have had us believe there was?
We had, the Liberals had, the previous government definitely had a unfortunate policy of, for example, I like to use the example of a plane. Every year we immigrate 250,000 people. That's all we take.
Right.
That is it. So that plane's only going to take 250,000 people to Canada, and that's it. But you can line up and say and buy as many tickets. We'll sell as many tickets as people that are interested.
Sure.
And so you had 500,000 people applying a year or more that were never actually going to be, and that backlog basically just grew and grew and grew. And because it was politically the sort of adjustment, the way the system was set up at the time to sort of turn that top off was to raise the point score. So we had a system that was based on, you got points on certain characteristics,
right?
And the way the system had been set up was raise the point score. If we're getting too many applicants, make it harder for people to get in. That became very politically sensitive because the minute you tucked the score and raised it, everybody said, well, you're tightening immigration, and it became a political football that nobody wanted to touch. And so they never raised the point score, which is the way the system was set up, and you ended up with this backlog of years. The immigration, the Conservatives tried to address this by rejigging the point score and making it more difficult, and they found that themselves similarly caught in still a backlog of 2 or 3 years. It cut down, I would say, on some of the numbers, but they still had a backlog. And now finally they've started this express system in which, you know what, we're only going to let this number, we're going to give people what are called invitations to apply. So you make an expression of interest, you file what's called a profile. Once we know that you're interested, we'll take a look and we'll decide whether you're among what they call the best and the brightest, and we'll pick you in. I think the system's got some flaws, and I think Alex will agree with me.
I would take that far further. I mean, the Conservatives have done some things here that are unprecedented in Canadian history. They essentially eliminated some of these backlogs by passing a regulation and returning people's money, even though they applied 6 or 7 years later. 6 or 7 years earlier. They basically said, sorry, we're never going to get to you. Here's your money back. That's the end of it. And if you recall, we had a show where we talked about the investor category and all of those people, many of them who were from mainland China and Hong Kong, who in 2013 basically just had their applications canceled, even if they had applied years and years before. And we've never actually done anything like that in Canada earlier. I mean, we had an attempt during the 2002 changes to process all of the previous cases within a limited period of time in an effort to try to finish them all. But we've never actually gone and said, sorry, we're not going to process you, even though you paid the money and expected the service years ago. So that's what the radical change that was undertaken, I mean, to some degree, to deal with that inventory. They took a very...
You said the store's closed.
The store's closed. Go away, effectively. And I mean, in the investor category, they effectively canceled the category.
But the point system still works to a certain extent, doesn't it, Alex?
Only through the prism of express entry. And the challenge is that the narrative that the government has come forward with here has been, and it's been successful to some extent. They've looked at ways where they can process more efficiently. And to gain those efficiencies, they've gone to systems that have taken away a lot of the human element out of immigration processing. Most of your listeners who know people who immigrated from the 70s, 80s, 90s, early 2000s, late 2000s even, a lot of those people came through interviews where they met a Canadian and a Canadian-based officer that was either abroad, in a visa post abroad, or at a border or in a Canadian office, said yes or no to them. And so there was a point of contact with a Canadian person somewhere along the line.
Is that gone now?
It's largely gone.
Gone. I mean, there is no interview.
There is no interview. Your language testing isn't assessed by an officer. Your language ability is assessed by a third-party language organization. Your education credentials aren't assessed by a Canadian government body. They're assessed by an approved third-party language provider that has to do that first. You don't have a place that you can go and ask questions of immigration because we don't have Canadian immigration offices anymore. You have a 1-888-242-2100 number where somebody maybe or maybe not answers your query.
So is this third-party assignment of tasks and the reduction of physical plants, is this all about economy? Is this all about saving the taxpayer money? Is that what they're describing?
100%. And to some extent it has worked.
Okay.
Because they've offloaded a lot of the cost of immigration processing onto the immigrant themselves. And
that must have changed the nature of your work, too, as immigration lawyers. Now, we having to adjust to continually new sets of procedures.
Well, it's also taken away some of the uncertainty in terms of you had a lot of subjectivity when an officer sort of assessed someone's English ability. So they're not trained how to do it. They come in and they say, how are you doing today? Tell me a story about what you did yesterday. And they take a look at their writing and they decide, well, that's an 8 out of 10. I'm going to, you pass. The next guy comes in and give a 4 out of 10. And you're looking at, I don't see the difference between. So we go to federal court to settle that because the officers were a little bit willy-nilly. The guys blowing his nose, doesn't like the look of him, and fails him on the English
Uh-huh.
ability.
But there was at least recourse in those
very,
things.
very expensive, though,
Right.
So this has removed that uncertainty, and we're sending it to a professional organization. But again, at the cost of the immigrant,
right,
up front, which I don't think is all that unfair, actually.
In some respects, there is efficiencies to the Canadian taxpayer, which are not. I don't disagree with Rudy. There are positives there from the perspective of processing. What's interesting, though, is it's not that the processing fees have gone down. You still pay exactly the same that you did when you did have an interview. When you did,
you just don't get it anymore.
You just don't get it anymore.
You don't get what you pay for.
You don't get what you pay for.
Okay.
So there's an element
still
there
take your money,
that's a little bit odd. I mean, given that you're getting so much less than you used to get.
Right.
At the same time, this piece of the immigration puzzle isn't necessarily being driven by immigration needs at all. It's really being driven by government agenda when it comes to processing of all kinds of government services. If you take a look at why we don't have so many visa posts abroad that have immigration sections, well, in many respects, we don't have as many visa posts abroad.
Right.
I mean, during the time that the Tories have been in power, they have sold embassies around the world.
Mm-hmm.
They've closed down and sold historical buildings, and to some extent, immigration has had to adjust to the fact that their service network abroad has been in these buildings that have been told they need to, the budget needs to be cut, and we need to withdraw from them. So that's been driven by that necessity.
But also, if you take a look at that, that's also changed the immigrants that come in. If you look at this express entry, which is now the only path, 85% of those applicants are here in Canada.
Right.
So this idea of, send us your, the American statute, send us your poor, send us your hungry, that's gone. We're immigrating people that are here.
Right.
85% of applicants going on in this new system, which is the only pathway through economics, are people here. Right.
All right. Let me take a quick break because, boy, we're just getting into this and a lot of politics in the program this morning. Glad to have you with us today. Our guests are Rudy Kischer and Alex Stojicevic from Maynard, Kischer, Stojicevic, immigration and citizenship lawyers, the proper order, no less. And we'll talk a lot about more about the current changes to immigration that the Conservatives are running on and what, if anything, they might additionally do were they to be reelected. And then we'll have a look at, what the other guys would do for Canada and our immigration laws. We're back after this quick timeout.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is The Law Show on CL 650.